This episode of Engineering the Future is brought to you by The Personal, OSPE's home and auto insurance partner. These past few months have shown us just how important it is to have someone in your corner. When it comes to home and auto insurance, The Personal can be that someone. If you would like to learn more about this exclusive program, visit thepersonal.com/OSPE.
This podcast is brought to you by OSPE, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, the advocacy body for professional engineers in the engineering community in Ontario.
Welcome to Engineering the Future, a podcast by the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. I am your host, Jerome James. Today I'm joined by Mark Frayne, a professional engineer and president of Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, and David Brown, professional engineer and past president of Professional Engineers Ontario. Mark, David, and I, along with several other veteran engineers and OSPE members, are a part of a reinstated Professional Engineers Act working group at OSPE. We recently completed a submission for the Ontario's Attorney General containing recommendations regarding changes to the Professional Engineers Act. Today, we're going to talk about that submission and the need for regulatory reform in Ontario more generally. To start, Mark, can you explain what the Professional Engineers Act is and why OSPE is recommending changes to this legislation?
I'd be happy to, Jerome. The Professional Engineers of Ontario, or PEO, are the regulatory body for the practice of professional engineers in this province. It's basically established under the Professional Engineers Act, which is legislation that falls under the responsibility of the Attorney General. The Act grants the engineering profession the privilege and power of self-regulation and was last revisited in 2017 when it was revised to incorporate recommendations, not all of them, from the Elliott Lake Mall inquiry. However, the 2017 revisions did not include any recommendations that arose from the 2019 coroner's inquest into the death of Scott Johnson as a result of the Downsview Park Radiohead concert stage collapse. While matters such as fees and other changes have been made through regulation, other issues have not been adequately addressed in more than 20 years.
Thanks for that, Mark. I do want to ask you a question, David, particularly within the role of the PEO. Professional Engineers Ontario is currently undergoing a governance review and changes based on recommendations from an external regulatory review report conducted by the Professional Standards Authority in 2019. You were president at the time and were taking part and making that review happen. Can you tell us more about your role and why you believe that the regulatory review was necessary?
Absolutely. I guess originally in 2013, when I joined the board of Professional Engineers Ontario, I went there as a practicing engineer, and I was really taken aback by what I felt personally as a practicing engineer, a certain level of dysfunction at the board's operation. And so as I went there in 2013, I started on that board. I worked my way up through the ranks and eventually running for president. And my sole purpose in running that year was that we would do a full governance review of PEO, which was long overdue. There had been previous versions of that done a number of years ago, and about 20 years ago, I think in the early 90s. But in each and every case, the board at the time felt they knew better and simply shelved it, and they collected dust. So my sole purpose of running for president was to try and convince this board to do a full governance review and really assess our role in protecting the public interest in Ontario. So I intended to do that. However, the board at the time that I was attempting to do this in 2018 had a number of individuals on it that were, shall we say, hard against any governance. Even the word governance being mentioned was an issue. So what I had to do was find the path of least resistance with that board at that time. And what I was able to convince them to do, and barely passed a motion, was to do a regulatory performance review, which was carried out by Professional Standards Authority out of England. Well, not out of England, but a gentleman by the name of Sir Harry Caton. And Harry Caton was able to conduct this for us during the term of my presidency, and then finalize the report in the early spring. This is something that PEO needed to have happen at the time and continues to need. And right now, as part of your question, they're going through a governance roadmap, which is a 2-year, 4-phase project, 4 phases. And they're pretty much finished about the 3rd phase of that now. And this year, what they're looking at, and this is going to be the real difficult portion for the new president, who is a wonderful gentleman, and I encourage him to continue trying to fight this uphill battle, but is to look at council composition.
Mm-hmm. Right. What was the initial reflection by council with the results of this report?
Well, one of the things that I wanted to make sure when I was president happened, which I mentioned to you has happened in other times this has been done, is that it gets shelved. Council receives it, and then it gets put on a shelf somewhere to collect dust up on the 6th floor. What I wanted to make sure happened with this is because we had somebody who is world-renowned regulatory governance expert, Sir Harry Caton, having him do this. I wanted to make sure it didn't get shelved. So part of the agreement was to do this performance review is that it would have to be, once it was received by council, made public. And it was in June of 18, I believe. Council agreed to do that after much discussion.
Okay, interesting. Back to you, Mark. In your view, what changes to the Act are most crucial?
That's an easy answer, is mandatory continuing professional development, and ensuring that PO's sole focus is regulation. That both of these are incredibly important. A lot of engineers don't realize, but Ontario is the last jurisdiction in Canada to require mandatory CPD. In addition, the dragging of the heels, I guess you would say, has actually jeopardized our position internationally in terms of recognizing our professional engineering accreditations throughout the world. The other thing I have to say is it's been so important to OSPE that not just myself, but probably the past 10 years, if not longer, the presidents and the board of directors have been advocating for mandatory CPD for engineers. It's becoming so important that we believe this will allow PO to always make the decisions in public interest, which do not require the approval of license holders.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Our society,
and you're saying that society would benefit from that. Do you see your industry benefiting from engineers with mandatory CPD?
Absolutely. Mining is no different than any other industry right now. The introduction of emerging disciplines and microtechnologies they continue to evolve at a very quick pace, and professional engineers need a new set of skills to improve public safety. Software engineering is a good example. Is everybody's car has software in it, and if that software isn't designed properly, then you could be driving down the 401 and all of a sudden you lose your braking system or something. And so it's very important that not only do we safeguard the public, we need to safeguard the environment. And engineers with our ability to solve problems and our analytical skills should thrive in this new knowledge economy, but we need to continue to develop our knowledge base.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly 100% agree with you on that point. David, in your view, what steps, concrete steps, are required for real reform at the PEO?
Well, that's a two-edged sword, Jerome. There's, in my opinion, over the years of being there, the governance step that I wanted to make as president, the reason I wanted to make it is because it's very difficult to work with a board that really, for the most part, some of them do, don't get me wrong, there's a number of them that do really understand governance structures on a regulatory body. However, many of them don't, and the real problem with the board members, a lot of the board members there, is they're too association-minded, if I can say it that way. They are concerned with the best interests of the members of the club, if you will, as opposed to the public interest. And it's something that myself and a number of other counselors, in fact, I'm much more pleased of recent years seeing the council as starting to understand their role in that side. But to answer your question, I would say it's twofold. One, at a low level, you have to look at things like diversifying yourself from chapters, which, is, in other words, getting rid of the association interests, which comes back to part of the working group that Mark and I are working on. And one of the things is one of the mainstay issues, or one of the mainstay aspects of our act that has been relied upon for years to do these association aspects is 244 of the act, which is kind of a catch-all clause, and it doesn't refer specifically to regulatory work. And PO over the years has been able to diversify what they do. In fact, a large majority of their budget every year isn't regulatory, it's association work and looking after the chapters, etc. But I think that's some of the ones they're doing, and they have to look at rebuilding the licensing system from the ground up. And it is in total disarray, and the current registrar is doing his level best with that, but it's a very large project. However, on the high level side, what I'm looking at is things that I look at as being nearly impossible for the current board composition to do, and which are, if you look at recent governance reviews done by other regulators, and not in Ontario, but Canada-wide, the high-level reform that a board has to look at doing deals with reducing its board size. PO, as you know, has up to 29 members under the Act allowed to be on that board. And nowadays, modern boards are 14 to 16. We need to look at a composition. Again, this is all stuff, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. This is stuff that other regulators have already recognized. And in fact, Harry Caton has confirmed that this is more modern regulation. Changing the composition to 50-50, elected to appointed, where the majority of the appointed the majority of the elected are elected based on a functional nominations committee. PO under our regulations has a nomination committee. It just doesn't do its job. It's whitewash. And they really need to have a nominations process that's skill based. And the last thing they really need to do inside of it, which normal boards do, is electing their president and chair from within the board members. Whereas PEO, as you know, it's a big thing each year, who's going to get elected as president. And usually, you have a president, as case in point is going to be next year, a fine gentleman, but he hasn't been on the board in 3 or 4 years. So it's very hard to walk in and say you're going to be in charge, and the president, and the face of PEO, and the chair of the board, and you haven't even been there for 3 years. And that is just wrong in so many levels I can't get at. So these things are type of things that I think to do at the high level. Now, the problem is that the board, and I think for the most part, although they have improved, most of the board is unlikely to vote themselves off the island. And so the only way I see, as part of your question, is the only way I see to have real reform there is likely going to involve being put under trusteeship by the Attorney General's office, our boss.
Wow.
And that is the only way I can see that they can push that rope and get them to do that in a reasonable amount of time. You remember, Jerome, I was able to, by the skin of my teeth, have this performance review done in 2017-18. Well, it's 2021. And if you add up of those 15 recommendations Mr. Caton put out there, very few of them have even been touched. And so that's kind of a typical scenario we see at PO. So it's a tough road to hoe. It's got to be done.
Yeah.
We hope you're enjoying this episode so far. At OSPE, we're here for you, making sure government, media, and the public are listening to the voice of engineers. You can learn more at ospe.on.ca.
Just a quick follow-up to all those recommendations or of getting things moving forward. Did you get a sense of what your average Ontario engineer felt about what was going on? Is there an appetite for change at the average engineer level within the community? Are they aware of these issues that are happening at the regulator?
Absolutely.
What kind of conversations were you having? Yeah.
Okay, well, absolutely. I hate to say the cliche, good question, Jerome, but it is. When I was running for president, one of the most startling things I found was that engineers, and I knew they were practicing engineers because of their age and how they chatted with me about where they worked and what they did. But what they asked me, they said, how can you help make our license relevant? They were looking for relevancy. All of us, I'm a practicing engineer. I always wanted to be able to be in a room with doctors and lawyers and be, close to being equal. And 50 years ago we were. But we're so watered down now because of the way our regulation, because of the way people are licensed, without having, our license is just too cheap. I have friends that are real estate agents with P.Engs. They've had P.Engs for 35 years. And I said, why do you keep your license? And the answer every time is, it's cheap. So when I look at that, you have a good question there, is that my feeling is people who practice engineering and by equation, members of OSPE, who I would argue mostly are practicing engineers, members of OSPE, we want real reform at PEO. We want to see them do their job, and we want to gain relevancy of our license. And all of those things can happen when we stop, when we get them to stop being worried about what the members think and more about what the public thinks. After all, that's our job.
Exactly. Great. Yeah, it makes sense. We want to feel that our profession is valid and still growing and relevant in the 21st century.
Especially
and
for
seeing
the,
that there's a
especially for the
future.
young engineers, Jerome.
Yeah. Right. Absolutely. Thank you for that. Mark.
Yes.
What's the next step for the engineering working group?
Well,
the Engineers Act working group.
I'd like to continue on with something that David said that I hold near and dear. Before I answer that question, it's the relevancy of our profession. More and more people consider engineers just civil engineers designing roads and bridges and buildings, but more and more engineers are getting involved in the short form is called ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance, part of building things and building companies and building communities. And that's something that isn't really recognized by the PEO, but we are as involved in hard infrastructure as we are in soft infrastructure, and more engineers are getting involved in the soft infrastructure, and we need to develop those skills as well. So what are we doing in this working group? Well, first of all, we want to continue and support the PEO as it strives to achieve the outcomes it's outlined in its transformation plan. We support the positive changes, but at the same time, we want to give them nudges once in a while to make sure that they continue on a path that is is beneficial to our profession and at a pace that is beneficial to our profession. There are expectations internationally and across our nation that Ontario needs to get our house in order in terms of professional engineering. So what is the next steps is we have worked through the group that looking at the PEA, the Professional Engineering Act, and put together a series of recommendations for changes. We're actually looking at two phases. The first phase is in terms of changes to the regulation or the act that can immediately take into effect and help the PEO through their transformation and make our profession stronger. The other one, the second phase, is looking more at changes that will really improve our profession and how we regulate our profession going into the future. So we're hoping that more importantly on that is OSPE is going through a strategic plan exercise right now, and contributions from our members and even outside our membership, right from engineering intern to a retired engineer to a midlife engineer with a young family and a mortgage to an experienced engineer who wants to start their own consulting firm. We need to hear from these individuals so we can make sure that how we move OSPE forward and how we engage the PEO to change the Engineering Act is for the benefit of our profession.
Absolutely. And Mark, how confident is OSPE on getting some of these recommendations adopted? Are we confident?
I am very confident because, as I said earlier, it's not just internal pressures. There's external pressures that are being applied to the PEO and to our the Ontario government to improve how the profession is regulated. And these changes are by default going to make the professional engineers more relevant to society. It's the one thing we have been is we've been very quiet publicly tooting our own horn. But as the OSPE president and chair, this is something that I've started to work on through social network and just interacting with individuals, explaining to how important and how ingrained professional engineers are in our society.
Excellent. And just one last question for you, David. What are other changes that will be required in the way of practicing professional engineering in Ontario going forward? Are there any other models in other provinces that we can learn from and adopt here in Ontario?
Most models in Canada, I also sat on the Board of Engineers Canada, so most of the regulatory models in Canada are very similar. Our acts vary from province to province in small ways, in some significant ways. One of the main things that I look at in our act, and as Mark noted at the very start of this broadcast, is that our act has had very few changes in a number of years.
Right.
In fact, it remained unchanged for a long time. Of course, as anybody looking at this or watching this is going to recognize, is that sounds very dinosaur-like. So we really need to look at how can we update this in keeping with modern engineering and technology advancements that are frankly growing exponentially in recent years. And that's something PEO really hasn't talked about. In fact, one of the major issues I wanted everybody to start talking about at the Engineers Canada level was artificial intelligence and how that influences whether or not there is somebody who's actually an engineer, or is it the software that has done the engineering. So looking at going forward from a regulatory point of view, I think most of the models are similar, but one of the main things I would like to see PEO address or look at, and BC recently did, I'm sure you heard of the recent changes in the regulator of regulators model that they have in BC. Right. But what they did look at is the definition of engineering within our act, or in their act they did. But back when our act was written, there wasn't, engineers were really, 5 or 6 main types of engineering, civil being one of them, mechanical, electrical, etc. But nowadays, that is not the case at all. In fact, we're only a small portion of the engineering as it's defined in our act is being carried out. So PEO and the government of Ontario, in respecting the interests of the public and safety, really need to look at the definition of engineering in our act and assess whether or not it fits to something that we as a regulator would be capable of performing. At this juncture, I would strongly argue we can't. The current definition is far too broad and far too deep, and it encompasses far too many things that PEO is not regulating at all. However, the public thinks that we are, and that scares the hell out of me when I was president, because we need to sit down and have an honest conversation with the Attorney General's office, the government of Ontario, our boss, and we need to say times are changing, and engineering has become way broader than what we're looking at here, and we can't regulate it. Right now, PEO essentially regulates engineering that is basically defined under other legislation, which is called demand-side legislation. For instance, I'm a structural engineer, and I have demand-side legislation that requires a building code act in Ontario, the Ontario Building Code, that I have to be an engineer to design a building. Well, we don't have a lot of that legislation. We're getting more, but we don't have much. But right now, there is a huge hole. And then one thing that Mark touched on too is that in Ontario, we're the only regulatory engineering body in Canada that has an industrial exception. So there's engineering carried on in cars that we can't regulate because they have an exception. We tried to have that removed a number of years ago, I think in 2013, but the government of the day decided to pull that off the table, even though it had went to third reading. So politics at its best. Any rate, that's kind of, I apologize for the long answer there, but I really see if we really looked at addressing our definition in the Act, I think that would be a good starting point to help us with the upcoming changes we're going to have to make in the public interest.
Great. Thank you so much for taking the time, David and Mark. These are serious issues that our profession has to deal with right now, currently, this day and age. We definitely don't want to shelve this for another generation and find that we wake up one day and engineering in Ontario is a profession that's outside of the purview of the professional engineer. And I feel like if we act now, we can definitely turn things around and have pride in the profession of engineering Ontario again. Thank you so much to the both of you. And if anyone is listening that is an OSPE member or otherwise and has input on this discussion or has a suggestion regarding the changes to the Professional Engineers Act, please reach out to OSPE at advocacy@ospe.on.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Mark Frayne is a professional engineer and president of the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers. David Brown is a professional engineer and past president of Professional Engineers Ontario. My name is Jerome James. This has been Engineering the Future. Thank you for listening.
From all of us at OSPE, the Ontario Society of Professional Engineers, thanks for listening. please be sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.